I'd like to ask the panelists their opinion about something. It's pretty clear, I think, from these presentations that technology is a very big part of architecture. But it's generally thought that architecture is primarily an art form, a building science perhaps, that actually uses technology, but isn't technology in and of itself. How do you make that distinction? Is there a difference between architecture and technology? Is there a symbiotic relationship? What are your thoughts on the role of technology in architecture now and into the future? Anybody want to go first? Sure, Martina will do it.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Yes? It goes actually for me right back to what I said earlier. We have to start thinking about interdisciplinary collaboration in order to really address some of the issues that we're dealing with our constructed environment in general. So that includes really design throughout all scales, from the product to the building, right up to the cities. Because if we're starting to think about climate change, what we're experiencing now, if we also consider that the constructed environment is responsible for 40% of the energy that we use, we have a really huge responsibility as designers in the way that we're actually creating our buildings. And then we really need to start thinking about throwing every means possible at the problem. And the furthest we can actually get through interdisciplinary collaboration. And that's why the STEM to STEAM or STEM to Teams movement I find incredibly important, because we really have to take down these boundaries that we traditionally had in between the disciplines and really start thinking about the issues we're dealing with and approach it through the problem itself.
Yeah. More. It has, interdisciplinarity will have a profound, already is, having a profound impact on the way in which we teach and the way in which we learn. No single discipline holds the key or has a monopoly on knowledge anymore. It's a matter of seeking out or learning how to search for answers and learning where to go about asking the questions. So any other thoughts that you might have, Sue?
Yeah, just in terms of commenting again on Eisenman's project where he utilized technology, digital technology. We had to work with other people when we were building that building. We had to work with mechanical engineers or structural engineers that were willing to take on a project that was that complex. So it had to be an integration of the fields to try to come to a resolution on how you're going to deal with these very unusual conditions that we were faced with the output of the design itself being so complex. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that technology is now very much a part of architecture. The architecture is a result of the combination of the art and the technology.
I think that architecture sort of acts as a transitional piece in between the STEM field and what's actually going on, where one of the people we came in contact with was a man, Mount Huber, out in California, who was doing all of this crazy algae research and helping us find the right strain of genetically engineered algae so it has the maximum lipid concentration. And he had all this going on, but it wasn't really being applied anywhere. So what we're doing is more so applied technology where it can become much more usable at a smaller level.
There we go. Technology is a language, regardless of what field you're in, whether it's code or whether it's algae. And what's wonderful, I think, about the field of architecture is that it's the actualization of imagery into a formal reality. It's not just sculptural. It is sculptural, but it's not sculpture. It has an urgent responsibility to create environments that ultimately have the functional and the aesthetic power to improve the quality of people's lives. In other words, whatever your field is, good design matters. It simply matters. And in the broadest sense, I believe that it was wonderful to see the School of Architecture become the College of Architecture and Design and expand that vocabulary somewhat. One of the things that you've seen here is the fact that nature certainly is very involved in some of these technologies, defined in its macro and micro scale. And ever since people inhabited this planet, we've been in some sort of relationship with nature. We've built environments to protect ourselves, buildings that would protect us from the elements, as it were, to shelter us, to provide sanctuary. We study patterns in nature, are inspired by it. If you go back to Greek architecture, you can see the capitals of columns with acanthus leaves, things from the surrounding shells and so on. We're now utilizing solar and geothermal energy to power our buildings and to create better thermal envelopes. We have nanotechnology, biomimicry, bioremediation, and so on. I'd like to ask the panelists what you envision the field of architecture, where it's headed next, or now even, in relationship to nature.
I know for me, I really want to see architecture kind of become this information system for people to become educated on different types of things happening in nature. So I know last year we worked on a project that was a library in the Ironbound, and one of the things that I was kind of focused in on was creating a facade that changes and creates this languageless way to inform people about air pollution that's happening. So kind of having it be this thing that people can understand and learn from would, I think, be fantastic.
I think architecture almost needs to take a step back as far as technology goes, because 200 years ago, they didn't have any of the technology or systems that we have now to power our buildings, yet they still had comfortable living spaces. And they did this by observing natural environments, for example, the angle the sun comes in and allowing the solar heat gain to heat the building, and looking at wind patterns so that they could naturally ventilate their spaces. And I think that we need to look at these things such as sun angles and wind patterns and other naturally occurring conditions, and we need to work with them rather than against them as far as technology goes.
Yeah, you're actually making a very, very interesting point. We became rather power hungry with the energy consumption in our buildings, and a lot of that, actually, if we are thinking about residential buildings in the United States, roughly use, I think, 36% for heating and cooling the environment. So what we're actually doing is manufacturing an interior climate. It's completely artificial, and we have the energy, the amounts of energy to do that, but we actually kind of lost track that we didn't used to do that and that we didn't have to do that. And a lot of the strategies that are emerging for materials that are actually taking advantage of ambient energies that are really everywhere are really helping us, I think, getting back to being more integrated into nature and our surroundings. So we have the photovoltaics, for example, that take sunlight and turn it into electricity for us. Or we have shape-changing materials that can change their shape depending on the temperature. Or we have phase-change materials that help us actually really level out the temperature in our buildings. And then we have all these fantastic strategies that Christine just mentioned, especially with the passive house. So we really have to think about different combinations of things. Learn from what we used to know, learn from what we can do, invent new things, and really through the combination, I think we can curb the energy consumption in our buildings and really make a difference.
Something that's also interesting is that the passive strategies that I also find, they're poetic and they're beautiful and they've worked throughout history, But what's also nice is we have newer technology that can help us assess the viability of passive strategies. Whereas in the past you'd say, okay, you know, this is my latitude and this is where the angle of the sun is, where my building is, and this is how I have to do my shading. Or you want to do an evaporative cooling strategy. I want to do a roof pond. This will be so cool. I'm going to have this pond of water on top of my building, and it's going to take the cool night sky and evaporate, and then the next day my building will be cool. It's like, yeah, but you're not in Phoenix, you're in Newark, so that's not going to work. So what's great is there are tools, like in particular, I like this tool called Climate Consultant. If you just Google Climate Consultant, it's a free software that UCLA developed, and it will allow you to test passive strategies in the environment where you're designing. So it's really nice, and it's easy to do, and as I say, it's free, so it's a nice tool. So I think that this combination of old and new can really give us the best way to move forward. The other thing I wanted to touch on that Martina mentioned is these manufactured environments we're in. Like right now, I mean, all year long, places are air conditioned to the point that you can wear a three-piece suit in July. I don't want to wear a three-piece suit in July. So we don't need to make our buildings like that, but we've made the comfort zone so narrow, and we kind of forget, like, oh gosh, I'm going to wear a sweater in the winter, I'm going to wear short sleeves in the summer. It sounds silly, but it's gotten down to that point where the mechanical engineer is told, hey, you need to make it cold enough in here that people can, you know, shop for products under really bright lights to make the product look good. Well, what does that mean for the cooling load? So I think, you know, those things have to be looked at again and bring back some reasonableness to what we expect from our indoor environments.
Okay, so to dovetail on that, I'm going to say that one of the interesting things about the interior environments is that a lot of them are actually controlled by laws, right? You have to have things at a certain temperature, that it's, you know, you have to have a room at 68 degrees. You have to have, and so that's controlled by laws. So in order to really address the issue of making environments that maybe it's okay to wear a sweater if it's cold out and it's 100 degrees, you don't have to walk around in your house in a bikini. And so I think part of our position as architects is we also have to speak out on these ideas, you know, because they're controlled by municipalities, they're controlled by government, and so on. And another thing that I'd like to talk about, which is that excites me very much about nature in relationship to architecture, is the study of animals, how animals' skins actually react to nature. Because our animals can actually adjust very well to hot and cold temperatures. And so when we study biology and try to understand biology in relationship to architecture, I find that extremely fascinating.
I actually want to pick up on the regulations around room temperatures. I think, of course, we have to advocate, but we also actually should look around and then look at what other countries are doing. When we think about Japan, for example, and how a few years ago they started what they called the cool biz, where all of a sudden it becomes rather uncool to actually wear a suit in summertime. Mm-hmm. And they had this huge advertisement campaign around that. And that actually really resulted in serious energy savings. So I think we can adjust ourselves, but we also have to advocate, and we have to get our government to do something about that as well.
There's no question about it. What you're hearing about is the fact that societies make choices. It comes right down to political will, it comes right down to values and priorities. And if your priority is to put a skating rink in Houston, Texas, in a shopping mall, which is an example I've written about extensively, then you're going to create these absurd environments that are utterly artificial. And in sealed buildings, and most buildings that have intense HVAC systems, they're sealed, you create horrible indoor air quality. And then you create disability. People become sick. I mean, how many of us have worked in buildings or studied in buildings where suddenly you're coughing, your skin's itching, you have colds, you're getting a headache? It's an invisible disability, and the environment is literally disabling us. making us less productive than what we're capable of being, right? So without a doubt, one of the things that architects can do successfully, I believe, is to become stewards of and advocates of a healthy environment, and really get involved with writing those laws, getting involved in governmental positions where you can have some efficacy. There are, again, choices to be made. You know, when you spend the kind of time and energy and creativity involved in this kind of education, it's not easy to say, I'm going to not design for a while, because it's your love, it's your passion. But on the other hand, some of us have chosen, as I've done in my life, to get involved in government in order to create laws that make sense, you know, instead of making people sick. Unless you have another comment, I have one other question I'd like to ask, and then I think, you know, it is getting a little later because we started a little later, but perhaps the audience might have a few thoughts that you'd like to share with us, or a couple of questions for the panelists. Here we are in Newark, very close to New York City, and one of the reasons the School of Architecture was founded here and not at Rutgers, New Brunswick, that was a big debate back in 1973, was because we were in a city. Cities are, you know, kind of laboratories for learning. And between Newark and New York City, we must have, without a doubt, the best of everything and the worst of everything. And it's a fantastic place to be able to teach and learn, because you can really see firsthand what that human impact has been. I remember from my design studio watching the Stella Wright houses imploded, you know, literally. And I had a student who lived in those projects, okay, an architecture student. It's quite remarkable what we can learn from and contribute to cities. So how do you, this is a very large question, but perhaps you might have some fleeting thoughts about how these emerging technologies that are being applied in architecture might have an impact on cities.
Well, cities is like that's my topic. I just love cities.
Go, girl.
So the way I see, I would love to see a zero energy city, and I would love Newark to start shooting for that here. So I think that would be really amazing to actually have buildings that would take care of themselves. We wouldn't have to have as much energy being used. The other thing is that I think that the digital technologies are really interesting in terms of bringing people together, and we see that a lot, again, in social networking through uprisings that came up in Egypt, the spring uprise, how people kind of could gather together and really advocate for things that are important in the city. I think social media is really important in terms of bringing the city together and and focusing them on issues that are important to their communities. So that's how I see technologies.
Cities are a unique entity, especially because they're one of the very few places left on Earth where people actually connect physically. If you're in the suburbs, you drive everywhere you go, you're connected very digitally through social media or through websites, but you're not connected physically. You don't go next door for a cup of sugar. That's not done. But in cities where, especially cities that don't have a lot of automobiles or parking's a problem, you're physically connected to the people around you. You touch people on the street next to you. You might want to avoid people on the street next to you, but you definitely have the ability to physically connect with someone, physically influence someone, and it's one of the last places to actually interact with people in person. So we have a great opportunity to make change in architecture by keeping cities that way so people do connect.
I think technology is going to shape cities in so many ways, and I think the change is going to come very rapidly as we start thinking about really integrating our cities into the Internet of Things, where all of a sudden smart devices and smart objects can be really incorporated in our entire environment. So the smart cities are going to really emerge very, very quickly through a lot of the technologies that are actually being developed in universities and research universities like NJIT right now. We're going to have, there are so many implications to that. I could talk about that for an hour, I think. I'm just going to skim across a couple of highlights, I think. I think we're going to be able to really have much safer traffic patterns. Transportation is going to be greatly improved. Energy savings, because we can actually program our environments to function very efficiently. Safety in terms of fast response in cases of emergency. There can be aids for an aging population. It could just go on and on and on, because we can really create these active, reactive, and responsive environments. And a lot of it is going to have to do with an innovation towards zero waste, zero accidents. And I think there is a huge potential in that. And the enabling technologies are being worked on as we sit here and speak.
Well, just one more thing when it comes to cities. I think it's the other technology that I think is super important is the internet access to the people of cities. Because although, yes, we can walk by each other at the corner, in a city like Newark that's broken up into 5 wards, most of us only gather, or those of us that are here in the room, gather in downtown or maybe in the East Ward, the Ironbound section. We don't really go to any of the other wards. And so the digital technology has a way of bringing people together from other wards into certain other parts of the wards, and the internet has a way of reaching out to those people. So it's not an architecture in the sense that it's not a physical building, but it is an architecture because it brings people into one space.
How many of you have been to the High Line in New York City? You may be surprised to know that I, along with 3 other architecture professors in the early 80s, proposed a linear park along the High Line. It wasn't the High Line. It was a derelict, abandoned, elevated railroad track that cut through several buildings. You know, was part of shipping materials from the port, from a ship on the Hudson River, and transporting them into industrial buildings for processing. And it was abandoned, and there was discussion about tearing it down. And it was a few of us, along with a group of very talented students, that actually began to look at the creation of a place of gathering. As Samantha said, cities are places for human habitation and collaboration. And could we make, especially out of a linear situation, a habitable space? Well, as you know, it brought nature back into the city in a very big way, the brilliant landscape architects that developed it. And it's now become an internationally famous landmark. I mean, people come here like they were going to go to the Statue of Liberty, they're going to the High Line. And of course, what did it do? It attracted star architecture around it. And it has become probably one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in the city. But it shows you what the creative imagination is capable of. It shows you what dedication to recycling can do. And the city, if nothing else, is a great big opportunity for recycling. Materials, human resources, water, air, all of those things. It's a very exciting time to be learning and to be involved in innovation. I think at this point, I'd like to see if anyone has a couple of questions or comments they'd like to make, and then we should probably wrap this up. Anything from the audience?
See, that's a really great question because it's hard to get your voice out when you're on a team of 9 men, not 6 men, sorry. It's really hard to get your voice out. But I think that it's really important to, to vocalize your opinions. I think a lot of us tend to bring aspects that we think are important. For example, whatever we're talking about, sometimes when you're working with a team, maybe the other members of that team don't find these things as important as we do, right? So if we're on a team and we actually vocalize our position, it's really important. It's also very important because, as you can see, none of us are talking about interiors, right? But when we take a job in a firm, the first thing that a lot of the employers place us on is interiors, because they assume that because we're women, we're going to be interested in interior design. So I think by us being up here and kind of talking about the things that we're talking about, kind of starts to break that barrier. So it's really important for us to stay in the field, to keep our voices heard, and to kind of fight for the positions that we want. When I was on a team, I'll just give you an example from working. When I was on a team, I started off as 1. We ended up with 5 guys. It became everybody wanted a piece of the pie. With less and less, I had less and less to do on that project. So I started complaining. I said, this is ridiculous. I'm the only woman on this project. It's a huge project. Well, they responded. They hired more women for the team. And that was actually really great because it diversified the team. And some of those women were hired in more leadership positions than the guys. So it started to equalize the playing field. People started to feel better at speaking up.
What field you're in, if you're problem solving, the first thing you have to do is identify the problem, right? We all know that. And then you're trying to figure out how to solve the problem. And when you design, you bring the totality of who you are to that perspective. And we all do, whether it's conscious or unconscious. We see what we're interested in seeing and what we've been told we should look for. And there has been a debate for, I can't, years and years and years, decades, about whether architecture is a social art or a formal art. Most architecture schools have found some sort of balance, finally. I don't think it needs to be either or. I don't see why beauty should be the prerogative of simply those who have the most. Beauty makes a difference in everybody's life. And I think when you've been socialized to look at the plight of people, then you're going to bring those concerns and that perspective to the work that you do. And when you begin to design in what I call an empathic mode, identifying with people's plights and concerns, you can't remain neutral from the processes and products of your own design. You're summoned to compassionate action, in which you seek to empower other people through your work, rather than merely imposing your own images on the world. And I believe that one of the things that women's voices brings to the field of architecture and to most fields is this sense of concern for well-being, whether it's well-being of people or well-being of the earth. There is a connectedness to life that I believe somehow we're intrinsically socialized with. I don't know if I don't believe in biology as destiny particularly, but certainly those voices are something that are part of humanity and need to be very loud and clear in the decisions we make. And I couldn't agree more. When there is balance, then you get, the right brain, the left brain, you get the total picture. You don't generally tend to leave things out that might be important. So I thank you for your question, because doesn't matter what field you're in, it's just the same kind of sensibility. And if this conference has done anything, and it's done many things, it has brought that to our attention. I think we started out in the morning by saying how energizing it is to be in a room full of smart women. I couldn't agree more. Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure.
fabulous panel and this fabulous audience. I want to urge you to actually go and see the Murray Center for Women in Technology, which is right around the corner, and walk by this gorgeous display of work that women at NJIT have done in all the fields of technology and design. And there's one more thing I want you to see over at the Murray Center. A group of students, Martina Decker's students, a team of them, designed revisioning the lounge outside the Murray Center. You can see their extraordinary ideas up on a big screen TV, and you can also see the Murray Center the way it is now. Now, next year is going to be our 20th anniversary, so I think we ought to have another conference because we'll be old enough to drink. And so you can look forward to that, and we'll keep in touch with all of you. You keep in touch with us. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.